going to speak to you about is the intertwining lives of two, or rather three, very different, very strange individuals, the first two of which are in the title of my paper, John Mennons and Alexander MacGillivray. Now these two men never met, never had any actual interaction with each other, and though they are both descended from Scots, they are not necessarily both Scottish, as I will give a bit more detail later. So the story I want to tell starts in Glasgow in 1783, and on January 27th, John Mennons began to publish his first newspaper in Glasgow called the Glasgow Advertiser. And the Glasgow Advertiser was incredibly fortuitous that it had been its first publication date on January 27th, 1783, because probably through the connections of his fiancée, Mennons was friends with the provost of Glasgow, who gave him probably the best scoop he could have got for his first edition, which was the announcement of the Treaty of Versailles concluding hostilities with France in North America. Now, unfortunately, Mennons was running his newspaper by himself. He didn't have a staff to help him print it, and because it was the night before the first edition, there was only one place he could put this breaking news, and that was in the back corner of the back page of his first edition. The fact that this momentous news has such an ignominious place in the newspaper has not been lost by later historians. Indeed, if you go to the Glasgow Herald, which the Advertiser was succeeded into, its Wikipedia page, its summary lead of the Herald says that its first news story was about American independence, which I think they slightly misunderstood, and it was on the back page and no one knows why. Well, hopefully as I unravel this story for you, you'll see the relationship between John Mennons and North America, and how the mechanics of newspaper printing really help us understand the content of news about North America, in Britain and especially in Scotland. So, what am I going to be talking about today? Well, I'm going to be talking about the humble reprint. And the reprint is sort of an important and indeed ubiquitous part of 18th and early 19th century print culture. Now, if you were going to be a newspaper journalist in the 18th and up into the middle of the 19th century, there are three ways you can get news content. The first is sort of a relic of the early modern newsletter. You have individual correspondence, people who send you letters who live near or know somebody who lives near the scene of the action. They send you a long letter and you reprint it or print part of it in your newspaper. And this, ever so humbly, displays that you, the newspaper editor, are well connected in political, commercial, and diplomatic circles. They did not have foreign correspondence. They certainly did not have roving reporters, as we would know them today, to go and collect this information. So they relied on it being sent to them, or maybe on occasion requesting it from networks they already had. The second way that they could get news was from local gossip, and this really filled most of 18th century newspapers. What was going on in town at the local councils, essentially the local parliament, pubs, jails, and courthouses, as well as the ports, quays, and shipyards. And this was very useful to the newspaper editors because they could go down, buy somebody a drink or a coffee, get the latest gossip, and get the scoop in their news story. So that showed that they were an important part of the local community, that they had connections nearby. But not everyone had these, and certainly not men like John Mennons, who I'll tell you a bit about his life story in a moment. John Mennons' role in Glaswegian society was precarious at best, and he had to rely in large part, as many printers in the 18th century, on reprints. Reprints essentially meant getting subscriptions to lots of other newspapers from around the world, cutting the bits you found interesting, retypesetting them, and putting them in your newspaper. You did not have to put attribution of any sort of where you had got it from, and indeed they often wrote things like, "Arrived in town today," which was quoted directly from a London or Glaswegian newspaper, when in fact it was somewhere in Perth or Birmingham that had no connection to the port whatsoever. So they often were a little too studious in how much they transcribed from these reprints. The reason they're able to do this is a couple of ways. First of all, there's no copyright in the 18th and early 19th century for newspaper material. In both the United States and Great Britain, the copyright, where it existed for literary works, works of fiction, books, novels, that sort of thing. Newspapers were either explicitly excluded or they were not mentioned, and no one was successfully able to pursue it in court until the end of the 19th century. There was also the idea that people accepted, appreciated, even encouraged reprint culture. The Sydney Gazette wrote as a header to one of its editions, "We are greatly flattered that our articles are occasionally copied in Britain. It showed that your newspaper was important." And it doesn't really damage any kind of competitive advantage. If you are a major metropolitan newspaper and someone else in that metropolitan area tries to copy you, you already have printed it first. You've got subscribers that way. And if somebody is in a provincial area or across the Atlantic Ocean, they're not necessarily competing with you for subscribers, so they don't really mind. And indeed, both the US and the British government gave preferential treatment to newspapers to do just that. In Britain, it was free to send newspapers through the post, and in the US, it was free to send them through the post if you were a newspaper editor to another newspaper editor. The idea essentially created an informal and completely free press association among these newspapers. And what I am really interested in these reprints is what they tell us about migration. And the reason it's so important for migration is the fact that before the telegraph in the 1840s became part of journalism, newspapers literally were manually transmitted by hand. If a person was going to bring a newspaper from Philadelphia or from Norfolk to Glasgow or London, somebody had to carry it, whether in a satchel or by hand. They had to carry it to the coast, onto a ship, across the ocean, and hand it through postal networks in Britain. So you could not transmit news unless somebody had transmitted themselves there. And you could not get news from rural areas, from colonial out-settlements, generally speaking, unless somebody was sending letters back home. So by looking at reprints of letters, reprints of local newspapers in small American towns, we get a sense of who had migrated there and was sending news back home to families. Often, newspaper reprints from America would be headed, "This was passed on to us from a local respectable family whose son, uncle, neighbor had recently immigrated to America." It gives us clues of the information they were interested in. The problem with 18th century reprints, as I said before, is they are anonymous. And there's lots of reasons for this. First of all, the structure of the printing trade. Most of these printers were brainy working-class boys like Benjamin Franklin and John Mennons. They were largely self-educated, living until later parts of their life. They both had similar trajectories, by the way. Living the most of their lives on the edges of respectable society. They had patronage in many cases, and formal correspondence was submitted to them, often anonymously. Thomas Jefferson gave frequently to local newspapers, but didn't necessarily have his name attached to any of it. They also had local gossip from people who would be within their own working class or lower middle class circles. People who might have a very educated, very interesting opinion, but whose name would not necessarily carry a lot of weight and was therefore left off in many cases. So there's a lot of difficulty in attributing authorship to any of these pieces of work, or tracing one author in multiple instances. How do you say this is the opinion of a particular type of person, let alone a person themselves? The byline is a post-1850s convention. Nobody included a byline. If you had, unless it was a formal dissemination of a speech, or proclamation, or letter to the public. There were Latinized pseudonyms, rusticus being a particularly common one, for commentary on local events, but again, these were meant to be purposefully obscure. And indeed, news was largely detached from authorship. They were trying to give you the most reliable facts of the things happening on the ground. Who wrote it, so long as they were authoritative or respectable, was not really important. The editor sometimes knew, he assured his readers it was quality information, and left it at that. This creates a problem for historians. How on earth do you use newspaper material if you don't know who wrote it? Well, you can use it as the first draft of history. a phrase that I've come to loathe and despise, because the newspapers are so inaccurate. The newspapers are trying their best to get information out as quickly as possible, and they make mistakes. John Mennons himself killed off Thomas Jefferson on no fewer than 3 occasions, far beyond his death in the 19th century, just because it was the latest information available. So how do historians use newspapers? Well, in my experience, they often use them for killer quotations, something that really epitomizes the argument they found in a newspaper. And that's fine. If they're not studying the newspaper itself, they're just looking for something about the period. There's often a conflation of editor, author, and location. Glasgow felt this way about this subject, or the editor or the owner of the newspaper, because they can't figure out who the author is. And that's absolutely fine. It's not great history, but historians have limited time and resources, and they cannot be expected to trace the entire pathway of every single newspaper article they are looking at if they're looking at bigger pictures of time and events, and this newspaper research is merely one part of it. This problem has, however, been made worse by the inclusion of digital archives. Finding killer quotations that have just the right keywords has become just so much simpler with keyword searching. And again, the material gets further and further removed of the context in which it was created. When you had to go down to the local archive and look at one set of newspapers in context of the region, people were more inclined to find contextual materials. Digital archives have made that less likely. So my current project is trying to trace dissemination pathways. And there's lots of different ways of doing this. One of the simplest ways is to find an article that you're interested in and use multiple terms in multiple databases to find other versions of it in earlier or later newspapers. See where it was reprinted. And this is pretty effective when you have one article to trace. But if you want to see the grand scheme of how North America was reprinted in Britain, this is quite difficult. You can't just rely on, well, this newspaper always copied from this one or occasionally attributed to this one. You have to use a little bit of digital history to get the idea across. So what I've started doing is using highly specific transcriptions that have the line, the punctuation, the capitalization, the typography as clearly as possible, and using things like plagiarism detection software and ingram or phrase tracking in order to see where bits and pieces of articles appear in different places. So a single paragraph from an article in an American newspaper might show up in different contexts in different places throughout the British press. And by searching millions of articles against each other, you can bring some interesting reprints to light. And this project is working alongside similar projects on the Library of Congress newspaper database, a project called Viral Texts. My project is looking primarily at the British newspaper collection, and hopefully they'll someday intertwine. So here's an image that is a little blurred out, but you can see these are 2 different articles that appeared in 2 different newspapers. The red text is similar, but the black non-underlined text is different. So you can see this bit of the original did not make it to London. It got left out. And this you can really dig into and say, why did it get left out? Was it just too long and that bit wasn't important? Did it not fit with their ideological viewpoint? Various other things that have gone on. So we turn to John Mennons. Now John Mennons was a baker's son, a baker's grandson, and a baker's great-grandson. He came from a long line of Edinburgh bakers. But he decided he wanted a different career. He wanted to work in printing. He wanted to have his own newspaper. And he briefly worked for the Edinburgh Current, but he wanted to start his own paper. And he couldn't really do that in Edinburgh. There's already many newspapers in the 1770s in Edinburgh. They're all well established. He's not going to get very far. So he decides to go to Glasgow. And there's only a couple papers in Glasgow, and they're pretty rubbish at this point. He marries into a respectable, eccentric Glaswegian family. They are well known to local Glaswegian history buffs. And he starts his own Glasgow Advertiser. He becomes an extremely well-established printer and newspaper editor in Glasgow, and he earns enough money that he decides to let the whole newspaper thing go and buy a coal field that was in the Glasgow area. Now, he really should have paid closer attention because the coal field fails miserably, and he ends up having to buy a different newspaper in Greenock. But the Glasgow Advertiser, after it's sold, becomes the Glasgow Herald and continues to this day as an eminent Scottish newspaper. Unfortunately, we don't know that much about John Mennons and how he ran his newspaper, because when he sold it, he refused to give the new buyers any of the financial records. He kept them in his own family house, where they mysteriously disappeared in the middle of the 19th century. So we're not entirely sure. There have been 3 accounts of John Mennons' life, all commissioned by the Glasgow Herald to find out what the founder had got up to, and they're still not entirely sure. So looking at the type of newspapers that he reprinted from, the choices he made editorially, we can get a view of what was going on in John Mennons' mind. His newspaper, as I said, was founded on the 27th of January, 1783, and its first major story was Peace with France. It was a weekly 4-page publication, so 1 sheet of paper folded in half, and it was printed on a hand-me-down printing press that the Herald historians figure he got for about £200. Or rather, he set up his entire business for about £200. And the Herald's incredibly honored by this, because they say that no extra money was ever invested in the Herald in its entire history. Everything has just been profits reinvested. So the Herald empire started with a measly £200. It's edited by him and his son eventually when his son grows up. It's likely his son helped around when he was a child, but they sold off their interest in 1802 and 1805 respectively. And it is incredibly reliant upon London news and Trongate or local merchant gossip. Actually, people who talk about the Glasgow Advertiser are not very flattering. They say it's an incredibly boring newspaper, but I don't think they give it quite the credit it deserves for his creative use of reprints. So the first person we're going to talk about that Mennons becomes interested in is this gentleman, Alexander MacGillivray. Now, Alexander MacGillivray is a son of a trader, Lachlan MacGillivray, who is trading in the southwest of what was then the British colonies. He is a loyalist and eventually gets his lands confiscated and he goes back to Scotland. But he is also the son of a Franco Creek woman of high birth, and he's primarily raised by his mother alongside his 2 sisters. And because her particular family group is a matrilineal society, she's of high birth, he is considered full Creek, Alexander. He's not considered to be in any way a lesser member of the tribe because of who his father is. And indeed, the relationship between Lachlan and his mother is considered to be very politically advantageous. They're gaining access to British traders, and he's gaining access to Creek and other Native American groups. His father doesn't take that much interest in his sisters, but does take an interest in him. He provides for him in many ways, educates him in Charleston and in Augusta, Georgia, and he's apprenticed for a short while as a merchant in Savannah, Georgia. In the end, however, he becomes the principal chief of the Upper Creek from 1782 until his death in 1793. He uses his pension that he gains from the United States in treaty negotiations to become a plantation owner with at least 60 slaves. And he is a very keen diplomat. He actually is able to negotiate with both the United States government and the Spanish government, sometimes at the same time, playing one against each other, in order to get the best deal for his people that he is representing. He repudiates the Treaty of New York, which he has with the United States, for peaceful interaction in 1792, and works alongside Spain. Now this is all sort of a way of saying he was a very important part of Southwest Native American relations with the early Republican government. He's actually touted by Washington and Henry Knox as being sort of the ideal person to deal with. They're able to have proper foreign negotiations with Alexander. And because of the Scottish connection, his name sort of immediately jumps out at you when you're reading a Scottish newspaper about the United States. Ah, Alexander, there must be some kind of connection. And indeed, when the Glasgow Advertiser mentions him on July 12, 1790, it makes it quite clear that this is a man of importance. This particular article, it's not the one I thought it was, but there's another one where they constantly, oh, here we go. MacGillivray, a Scotchman. They want to make it quite clear this is not just one of the other Native Americans we've talked about in this newspaper. This is someone who is somehow related to us. So you have this bit of information from July of 1790. It's one of the first mentions of any kind of conflict in southwest Georgia with the Native Americans and the United States. And it really gives an idea of how this relationship is growing. Most of the news about America at this point was about the Northeast, about the politics of the new republic and how it was coming together. This is frontier life, and one of the earliest pieces about frontier life. So where did it come from? Well, unfortunately, it did not come from the Glasgow Advertiser. He did not receive any of those letters from Alexandra in Virginia. It in fact came, as far as we can tell, from the London press. And the way we can tell it came from the London press is because of the Public Advertiser. Now, if you look at these two articles, they are identical, word for word, although the typography is slightly different. The Public Advertiser realizes that the Cherokee and the Miami are different groups, whereas the Cherokee Miamis is just a single group, according to Mennons in Glasgow. But the Public Advertiser comes out later. So how do we know where they both came from? Well, both of them say that they came under the heading London News, July 9th, 1790. So there's a mystery third London newspaper they're getting this from. And indeed, Edinburgh copies it as well from this as well. So this news story about MacGillivray and General Wayne is proliferating pretty much throughout the United Kingdom. And I didn't show all of the examples, there are many, but these are the main ones I wanted to highlight. And in the end, it becomes part of the Gentleman's Magazine and Historical Chronicle, which is a magazine printed in London, sort of a digest of all the news of that month. And this takes a slightly more paraphrased version, as opposed to the direct translation the others had worked with previously. So what can we tell about the pathway of this? Well, first of all, wherever it came from, whoever actually received the letters in London, very limited changes take place to the text as it goes along this pathway. Nobody's adding any additional information or taking any information away. It's not like other reprints where bits of detail and commentary get added. They're all derived from the same place, more or less. It's not evolving. And what this really tells us is that initial instinct that I had of, there's a Scottish connection, is probably unlikely. It's a generic story that's appearing throughout Britain in more or less the same way everywhere. The next appearance of Colonel Alexander MacGillivray is in 1792, and it says the celebrated chief of the Creek Nation, an ally of the United States, died lately in the Creek territories. He passed most of his life in the remote parts of America. By his regulations, the Indians have been very much civilized. His death has occasioned universal regret among his people. Now, while the death of MacGillivray did cause universal regret among his people, he did not die in June of 1792. The keen of you will remember he died in 1793, a full year later than this article came out. So again, Mennons is killing people off before their time. But he's trying to get the news story out. And he got this again from London, from the Lloyd Evening Post, or the Evening Mail. And this is where it becomes important. How do you decide which of these stories, there's the Alexander content there, and you have to decide which one it comes from and what the difference makes. Well, the plain and simple matter is that if it had come from this one, which I don't believe it did because of the slight different typographical changes, he purposefully ignored all this other information about the Americas. None of that actually makes it into the Glasgow Advertiser. It's just the story about Alexander MacGillivray. And that raises some questions. Why is that the only piece of information he decides to retain? Now, if you look again carefully at the Glasgow Advertiser, where it says it got its news from the London papers of June 20th, not the Evening Mail, but the London Evening Post. So he didn't actually have to worry about all that other Boston news. It wasn't relevant to him. So when you look at these simple reprints and you actually analyze where he's getting his news from, How important was MacGillivray? Well, his death is the first mention of him in 2 years, and he hadn't actually died. There was no kind of background research to the story. And the larger curation of American news was not taken. So, in the end, it really becomes a matter of the fact that he's trying to complete the story of MacGillivray. He's seen this in his London subscriptions, he's picked it out and put it in the midst of all this other London news, but it's just a little bit of extra information. It's just something, a tidbit that someone might find interesting. It's not the main focus of his newspaper. Something that gets a lot more coverage, I think, is the Harmer Campaign. And the Harmer Campaign was a disastrous military campaign in the Northwest Territories in autumn of 1790. It was a plan hatched by Sinclair and Harmer to eradicate, or at least severely harm, the Northwest Native American groups under Little Turtle and Legree. So the forces that were assembled in order to take down these Native American groups were comprised mostly of regular officers and cavalrymen, men who were part of the growing standing army, and a group of Kentucky militiamen. And this part of the story is very important, partially because of the number of Scots who traveled to the Kentucky frontier. And throughout the Glasgow Herald, you get lots of Kentucky news because of the level of migration and news coming back from that particular area. No other part of the United States quite makes the impression Kentucky does in this period. Hardin, who is under Harmer, has a humiliating defeat. They do a very bad job at attacking the Native American groups. Most of the commanders, except for Hardin, die, and Harmer and Hardin have to save their reputations in a military tribunal. And the reason their reputations are so badly injured is not only did they run away, some say like scared little girls, but they left all of their killed, the men who had died, to rot in the battlefield. It's not until a year later that Anthony Wayne returns to the battle site that the bones of the dead are buried. So they come across as incredibly cowardly and uncaring for their men. And this really heightens anti-Indian and anti-officer sentiment in Kentucky. And it's quite a big news story in the United States. So when it appears, and this is only a fraction of a very long article, appears in the Glasgow Advertiser, it has the byline, Richmond, Virginia, December 1st, 1790, appearing in Glasgow in February of the next year. And it's a very complete story of the accounts, and it's actually surprisingly accurate. It really meshes very well with what historians now think actually happened, and is quite different from some of the other accounts of the time. So the first account that I could find from other places in Britain was from the London Star of February 1791, but it's quite different from the Glasgow one. You see that it's weighted with expectation instead of with impatience, and various other slight changes. But it says it got it from the Bahama Gazette. So this news is going from Virginia down to the West Indies and then back up to London. It's taking sort of a windy path. The other place it appeared, approximately the same time, is from Richmond, is from the Evening Mail on the 14th of February, 1791. And that has the telltale impatience rather than expectation. So this is the version they got it from, which seems to be slightly more direct. So how do we know where it came from? Well, there are minor changes, differences in how the date is being reckoned, impatience versus expectation, and the final line says that they are waiting for further particulars or they're waiting for the whole truth of the matter. So somebody along the line has changed some of the text. So this is the original I eventually found in the Virginia Gazette and Alexandria Advertiser. And it's sort of mushed in with this other bit of local news. And it gives the account, and it's exactly the same as the one that the Glasgow Advertiser did not copy. So the Glasgow Advertiser has got the bad copy. It's not quite right. So how do we figure out how it got from Virginia to London and Glasgow with so many little changes? Well, the little bit of related news that was on that article is immediately lost. Nobody in America even reprints that section, so we don't know where that went. So we have to look around the newspaper. What can we find out to help us trace this? Well, in the Glasgow Advertiser and in the Evening Mail, there is another news story, which is someone being stabbed in Honduras. And that story appears both in the Glasgow Advertiser, next to this story, and in the Evening Mail. So that stabbing in Honduras is important information. So you have this from the Mosquito Shore, the tailing of a Spaniard has stabbed him in the heart with a stiletto and then fled. Not a terribly nice story. And what's interesting about this story is it doesn't just appear in the British press and the Jamaican press where it's originally attributed, but also throughout the United States as well. Accounts from the Mosquito Shore say, identical text line for line in New Hampshire and various other places in the United States. So you have this story which appears throughout the United States. You have the story about Hardin's defeat, which appears throughout the United States. But only in the New Hampshire Spy do both stories appear. So the London version of these two stories has most likely come from the New Hampshire Spy. And therefore you have a correspondence network of some sort between these two newspapers. So a story about Virginia has gone through Bahamas to London and stopped there. And this story has also gone from Virginia up to New Hampshire, over to London, and then on to Glasgow. It's a different piece of news. It'll have different paratext material around it, and will give the reader a different impression about what's going on in the Americas, a different view of the world. And also, impatience gives a very resounding bit of information. So there's some key things I wanted to point out about this. First, all of these stories appear in the New York press, but they're not in the same newspapers. As I said, they only both appear in the New Hampshire Spy. And I think that's really important. In a recent book, Joel Weiner says that the New York press was essentially the American press. It was the press that London copied the most from, and that British papers weren't all that interested in American news. None of these statements are true. The New York press is not really that heavily relied upon by British press agents. They get lots of news from Boston, from Virginia, Georgia directly, and from, again, New Hampshire and Connecticut. The Delaware Chronicle gets copied quite often. And the British are pining, or at least the editors are pining for American news, because it fills the pages. The Glasgow Advertiser actually has at least one American news compilation every single week. So it's very interested in what's going on with their prodigal cousins. So by mapping this out, we can tell where the typography went and who are the gatekeepers, or the people who are deciding how this information is curated and placed beside each other, and how the story of these American frontiersmen are being told. This account being particularly sympathetic towards the Kentucky militiamen. So I've told you all this. The Advertiser is relying on London. That can't really be denied. But London is not relying on major US cities. It's relying on what we would consider the provincial press. And the London language is largely shaping the Glasgow version. The original Virginian story uses different language than the Evening Mail. The Evening Mail has made the story more exciting, more interesting, and Glasgow's kept that language. Yet, you have to take a little bit closer look at some of these accounts. This one was printed in July of 1791, so 5 months after the original account of Hardin's defeat. And it's from a letter from a gentleman in Norwich, Connecticut, and it tells, again, in very, very detailed language, what exactly happened that day that Hardin's men died. But it's so many months afterwards, you have to sort of wonder, why are they printing it now? And indeed, if you look at the original story appears in the Norwich packet in January 14th, 1791. And news stories don't take that long to appear in the Scottish press. They take 2 to 4 weeks, depending on how much trade is going on. So why is this appearing in July? Well, the answer to that is it doesn't appear anywhere in London. The first place that it appears, actually, is in a number of different magazines that are published throughout Britain, giving this account. So Mennons, for all of his faults of constantly copying the London newspaper, was actually interested in this story enough to go seek out additional versions of it in non-typical places that he normally went for his newspaper. So he went to the Gentleman's Magazine and a couple other places and parsed together some of these accounts, even though it was several months later. So, how do we put together these different stories? Well, the Advertiser rarely makes any changes to its London text. It generally copies them wholesale, and this is quite different in the 19th century when the Herald is quite fast and loose with the evidence. And the London newspaper rarely makes any significant changes to the American text. So we as historians have to ask ourselves, is this laziness or is this laudable? Are they just copying and pasting because they really can't be bothered writing their own news stories? Or are they giving an authentic American voice to their readers? Are they not changing the text because that would damage the credibility of their newspapers and make it less likely to be useful to them? And I think probably it is the latter rather than the former. Many of the newspapers in their mission statements make it quite clear that they are presenting the news as it comes to them, the most reliable, authentic, and immediate news they can provide. That is their mission statement. That is what they are trying to do. And the fact that Mennons is running this newspaper by himself means that he's able to, not able to really write that much copy, but he is reading a lot of newspapers. As I try to piece together these pathways, he's not always using the same 2 or 3 London papers. He's taking it from 10 to 15 different publications, as well as magazines and local gossip from ship captains. He's really putting the work in, even if he's not changing the voice. And that's something I think is really important. I think that we discount scissors and paste journalism perhaps a little bit too quickly. The other thing that these pathways really tell us is about pre-curation of content. The news, as it comes from America, comes from many different sources, from letters, from gossip, from printed accounts. And at every stage in its pathways, it gets compiled and put into little bite-sized packets of news in New Hampshire, in London, and in Glasgow, because sometimes Glasgow is copied by Edinburgh. And never is a whole page taken, or a whole America or London section taken. But quite often people will take 2 or 3 articles in succession, or 2 articles from the same page and put them together. So there is an element of curation and choice at every node in the pathway that should be recognized as somebody making an active decision about how this material is presented. Archives are not value neutral. So smaller subsets are taken and recurated. And by looking at what's taken and what's left behind, you can see what a person found interesting, or at least what would fit in the amount of copy they had left at that particular day. So these 2 stories of MacGillivray and Harden, what do they tell us about the wider frontier discourse of Glasgow and the Scottish frontier, and the American frontier? Well, in some ways they're very representative of the wider research I've done. They're taken from an ambiguous London press. The Glasgow Advertiser never, ever says which newspapers it gets particular articles from. It takes quite a lot of effort to pin it down. And they're largely American in authorship. If it's about the United States or from British North America, it tends to be written by people in those areas, rather than paraphrased by British commentators. However, they are also outliers in a lot of ways. First, they're significant named figures. They're people who are familiar with North American history would recognize Harmer and MacGillivray, as I think some of you did when you came in today and probably expected a different paper. This is really strange. The vast majority of North American news that comes into the Glasgow Advertiser is about anonymous settlers, local people who seem very important to the Boston, New Hampshire, or Virginia newspaper, but who would be wholly unknown to the Glaswegian audience and indeed to modern historians. People who get struck by lightning, die from smallpox, or have rousing evenings at the pub that end in a duel. These are sort of the stories that generally make it about frontier life into the Glaswegian press. They're also unusual because they get mentioned more than once. Most of these stories get one shot at the Scottish press. In these ways, Mennons actually went to a lot of trouble to finish the story up and conclude the narrative. And probably the most interesting part of these two stories is that Glasgow and Edinburgh shared them. There's a lot of snobbery between the Glasgow and the Edinburgh press in the 18th century. And this is one of the very few times that I found before about 1810 that both Glasgow and Edinburgh either took from the same London papers or shared between each other. So they're very different narratives in different parts of Scotland. And this is one of the few times they actually shared the same topics of conversation. So what is my concluding thoughts about this type of research? Well, first, tracing a dissemination pathway allows us a better understanding of who was writing, revising, curating, and omitting knowledge about frontier life. It's so very easy when trying to figure out what's going on in the colonies to look at newspaper accounts as realistic descriptions. Now, most historians know that all sources have their flaws and they try to corroborate them, put them in context. But without really tracing the full dissemination pathway, we're not seeing the full context of why those editorial decisions were made, because we don't know who's making them. It also suggests the physical pathways between major and minor cities beyond the postal and major trade routes. If I were to believe Joel Weiner and various other newspaper historians, or indeed historians of trade in the Atlantic world, I would believe that Glasgow would have extremely strong trade links with certain key ports. But indeed, the vast majority of its news came from places it did not have trading connections with. These were places that settlers were going and that families back home would be interested in hearing about. And by tracing the dissemination pathways, I can figure out where are the local newspapers they're getting this information from and how they are transferring, either directly from America, as was sometimes the case, although not today, or through London and curation of news that would be interesting to his subscribers. Thank you very much.